Let's talk about grids. Whether you are a student who's going to need to take a registry, a new graduate who's figuring things out at your new job, or you've been in the field for years but you're about to sit for your CQR exam, it's important to know about grids, both practically and for examinations and registries. So let's talk about them. We all have to commit to memory that a body part that is thicker than 10 centimeters or 4 inches requires the use of a grid. So that is something we have to know for the registry, for the CQR exam. But sometimes I see new graduates who are new in their position forget to use a grid, and usually around portable exams. And one of the reasons for that is sometimes we just haven't committed to memory what 10 centimeters or 4 inches looks like in real life, because that's a number to us. My practical suggestion is find some sort of household item that you are familiar with. Like, I know that a small coffee mug, an average size coffee mug, is 10 centimeters tall. So if I go do a portable shoulder and I look at that patient's shoulder, I can go, oh, that's definitely thicker than a coffee mug is tall. If I went to go do a pediatric exam and I see their tiny little shoulder, I can think, it's not as thick as a coffee mug is tall. I don't need a grid. That really helps us apply the knowledge of the numbers to real life. You might wonder why we use a grid. So this is a picture of my wall in my office. And what I did is I turned off the lights and I used a flashlight. You can see that there's a lot of light here, and then the other parts of the image are a little bit darker. And you'll hear me say time and again that X-ray behaves a lot like light, which is why we use a collimator light. This shows us why we need a grid though, because you'll notice that the light is a lot more concentrated right in the middle of this picture. And the same thing happens with the X-ray beam. The X-ray beam has a lot more X-rays right in the middle. And as it goes out, it doesn't have as many X-rays. So it's a lot more concentrated in the center. So a grid helps deal with that, and it makes the image even. That's a very basic way to explain it, but your books are pretty detailed, and that kind of helps you put it into practical application. Now, when we talk about grids, we also need to mention the Compton effect, so scatter radiation that happens in the room. We have this radiation kind of bouncing around in there, and that can wreak havoc on a beautiful image because it comes back to the image receptor and makes it not as detailed. It kind of gets this fuzzy gray look, and that grid will actually prevent that scatter radiation from touching your image receptor. You might wonder where the grid lies in relation to the image receptor, and this is my basic illustration of that. So we have the patient, we have the X-ray tabletop or wall bucky if they're standing up. Below that, we have the grid, so it's right below the surface. Below the grid is the image receptor. So remember, the radiation is going to touch the grid first so that it can basically filter out what's not needed. And then it's going to hit the image receptor where it will create the most beautiful X-ray you've ever taken in your life. And if we are at an X-ray tabletop or a wall bucky, we are going to have a bucky tray that holds our image receptor in. There are different types of grids, and that's important to know what those types are. So grids are made up of strips of high attenuating material like lead. And a parallel grid, you guessed it, the strips are parallel to each other. We also have crossed grids that look like they're crisscrossed, just like this. And then we also have what's called a focused grid. And that focused grid really kind of matches the angle of what the X-ray beam does with the lead strips. So please be kind to me. I drew this on my PowerPoint. But the green lines are my X-rays, and the red lines are my lead strips. And my convergent point, of course, is up here, and it comes down, my X-ray beam comes down into my grid right here. And it filters out the unnecessary radiation that's going to make this a fuzzy, gray, blurry-ish looking image before it gets to my image receptor. So again, this is a focused grid. Sometimes, though, our grid isn't in the right place. And this usually happens, to be honest, more with portable exams, because when you're in a room and you're above the table or centering to the wall bucky, you're right in the perfect place where if it is a focus grid, it's not going to matter because you are locked into place. And with a portable, you have the leeway to be off center. So if you had this happen, your x-ray beam is going to hit basically at the wrong angle of those lead strips, and you're going to get grid cut off. It's going to be an ugly image, and you're going to have to repeat that. Something else that we often see is a tipped grid with portable exams. And really, this is just kind of off level. This happens sometimes because of the cushiness of an inpatient bed or a stretcher, and also sometimes because our patient's weight is more to one side than the other, and it causes the entire grid and image receptor to tilt. And when the x-ray beam doesn't match that, it will also cause grid cutoff. You can see that the green x-ray lines aren't lining up to go in between the red strips of lead. It is really important to know for any type of examination your grid ratio. So your grid ratio is the height, that's the H, over the inner space material, that's the D. This is an example of a little bit of grid cutoff, and you can see what I'm talking about. It looks kind of gray and yucky. We don't see that high contrast that we can see when everything is lined up and centered appropriately. And once in a blue moon, you might see something like this where you actually get grid lines, and that is definitely go back and repeat both of those images. So let's look at what the grids really look like in our x-ray rooms. So this is the wall bucky in one of our rooms, and we have pull-out interchangeable grids. This one is for 40 to 72 inches. And that'll get us anywhere in between moving our patient. There you can see the image receptor between SIDs. It's important to note that grids do line up with that SID because remember that can change the x-ray beam and how it's hitting that image receptor. We do have other interchangeable grids there, and you often see those for our UHTH site. We do keep that green grid in with our GE rooms, and it looks like this, and that's that 40 to 72 inch grid, and it just pulls in and out. Why does that remove, you might wonder? Because we can remove that, tilt the wall stand down so that it is parallel with the floor, and then we can then use that image receptor for extremity work like hands. And do you need a grid for a hand? Well, think about that. Here's the thickness of your hand, and here's the thickness of my coffee mug. Absolutely. No, you don't use a grid for a hand. So that's why we can actually remove it from the wall stand. Now we also have a grid that lives in the x-ray table. Here you see my image receptor pulled out with Bucky there. So if you were going to do something like a foot, you would of course want to take the image receptor and do it tabletop because you don't need a grid for the thickness of a foot. Here's another example of what a grid and a wall Bucky looks like in our digital rooms. And right behind it there you can see the image receptor. What about portables? So with portables, we're going to have an image receptor, and then we're going to have something that looks like this. This is what our grids look like here at the UHTH site, and it's this black pop-on grid, and it will always have more information about the ratio and how it works on the underside of it, and that just snaps on to your image receptors. We have a larger image receptor and a smaller one as well. So we actually keep that on the portable unit itself. Now, something that can be a little bit confusing to people who are new to a site is what an actual grid looks like and what an image receptor holder looks like. So this is actually not a grid. And you can see that by this little guy right here telling you it's not a grid. This is just something to protect our image receptor and also to make it a little ergonomic for you. It has a handle on it, so it kind of helps with cart work and portable work. And sometimes I see brand new people to our site thinking that's a grid. They grab it and then they wonder why their image doesn't look great. It looks similar to this black grid, and if you want to make sure that it's a grid, flip it over, and again, on the underside of it, you're going to see the details that, first of all, clearly identify it as a grid, as well as telling you a little bit about the ratio. You'll also notice on this one that it helps you with those centering lines as well, because we don't want to be off center with something like a focused grid. So I hope all of that helps a little bit with grid usage in real life. Don't forget, if you're going to sit for a registry or a CQR exam, you're going to want to know grid ratio, the formula. You're going to also want to know the types of grids, what they do, and don't forget about always using a grid for 10 centimeters of thickness or above.